Right, our next session focuses on mental wellbeing. I'm delighted to introduce Michael Crossland, Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Institute of Ophthalmology, and Rachel Canavan, PhD student in psychology at UCL. They'll be discussing their research into the emotional and psychological impact of inherited progressive vision impairment on young people. Welcome, Michael and Rachel.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as we heard, we're going to talk about some of the research which we're doing at Moorfields and University College London on the mental well-being of young people, particularly with inherited eye disease. So I'm going to start off by speaking about some of our research, then Rachel will take over halfway through to talk about some of the other stuff we've found. So to start off, we have no commercial relationship to declare. Most of the research we're going to talk about now is funded by the Macular Society and by Moorfields Eye Charity. And I'd particularly like to thank Bavner and Stargardt's Connected, who've been a really big supporter of this work in lots and lots of different ways. And of course, Retina UK for the invitation here to speak. So thank you to Tina, Denise and Kate for that. So what is well-being? We all have a sense in our head of what well-being is. And if you look at a dictionary definition, I think this is as good as any. It says the state of being healthy and contented. That's from Chambers English Dictionary. And the World Health Organization have their own definition, which is well-being allows individuals to realize their abilities, cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to their society. So a slightly wider view of what good well-being looks like. And this has been debated for centuries. You go right back to Aristotle, and Aristotle spoke about hedonic well-being, that's things like happiness and sort of life satisfaction, hedonism, and eudaimonic well-being, which is about people's psychological function and how well they are part of society and contribute to society. But the key thing about well-being is good well-being is not just not having a mental health condition. It's a little bit like health is not just the absence of disease. Good well-being is not just having no mental ill health. So, what happens to your well-being if you have an inherited eye disease or vision impairment at all? There's quite a lot of research now showing that there is a relationship between having vision impairment and having lower levels of well-being. So, for example, there's data from Norway, about 2,500 adults showing that this sort of relationship. And again, a larger study from the USA, about 5,500 people from the USA, again, showing people with vision impairment to have lower levels of well-being. And recently we've looked at this using Health Survey England data for 7,500 people in the UK, adults, showing that how well people describe their vision is quite closely related to their level of well-being. So the plot on the right here, the graph on the right, shows that people who have excellent vision, describe their vision as excellent, have the highest level of well-being, and that is significantly lower if people say their vision is very good or good, and then people with fair or poor vision have the poorest levels of well-being on average. But there is good news as well, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. So what I'm going to talk about today are three different things. First of all, we're going to talk about what factors limit well-being in people with inherited vision impairment. We're going to then talk about how the lived experience of people with vision impairment will also affect their well-being. And finally, about what strategies people find helpful and find unhelpful to maximize their own well-being. So in our lab, we tend to work in what's called a mixed methods approach. This means combining different types of research methods to get to the right answer. I'm going to talk first of all about our quantitative research techniques. So these are things like questionnaires, like clinical assessments, which give us numerical data, which we can then analyze statistically. So I'm going to speak about that first of all. And Rachel's going to focus on our qualitative research, which is more narrative, more words-based, finding the sort of the underlying themes behind the results we find. And we call it mixed methods because the two feed into each other. So our sort of numerical data feed into how we perform our qualitative research and vice versa. So to put this in other terms, we talk about the quantitative as being sort of black and white, and the qualitative research is giving colour to our science and giving more details about it. Okay, so talking about some numbers first of all. We have a very good scale for measuring mental well-being, which is called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. This is a 14-item questionnaire, and it asks people about their life over the last 2 weeks. And the questions like, I've been feeling good about myself, I've been interested in new things, and people say whether they've been feeling that emotion all of the time, or sometimes, or never, and so on. It's a very psychometrically robust questionnaire. That means you can do very good statistics on it, it's very reliable. And it's really widely used. So, for example, those of you in Wales, every secondary school student in Wales has this assessed as part of a research study. The Health Survey for England, which I've already talked about, uses it. And those of us in the NHS, a part of our staff survey is actually these questions as well. So we wanted to know what affects well-being in people with inherited retinal disease using this instrument. And we thought of 4 different groups of things that might affect this. The first is the severity of their disease, so how bad the visual acuity is, and the duration of disease, how long we've had the disease for. The second are demographic factors like people's age, their gender, their socioeconomic status, and their ethnic group. The third were psychosocial factors, so these are things like loneliness, like health utility, which is a form of vision-related quality of life, and activity limitation, how much the condition limits people's daily tasks. And finally, we wanted to look at the role of mental ill health, so depression and anxiety. So for this stage of the study, we looked at 36 people with inherited macular disease in this case. These were a range of adolescents and adults, ranging from 13 to 76 years. And they were all recruited from Moorfields from the low vision or genetic eye disease clinics. So it's important to say these people were in touch with services. These are people who are attending clinics, who are willing to take part in research. It's probably not completely representative of everyone with inherited eye disease. And we performed various assessments using mostly on a 1-hour Zoom call with a person performing these instruments, and also extracting relevant details from their hospital notes. So what did we find? Well, our mean wellbeing score on this Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale was 51. And importantly, that is not significantly different to the general population of people from Health Survey England. So in other words, the average person we saw in our low vision clinic with inherited macular disease, their well-being was the same as the average person we could stop in the street outside the hospital. So this is really good news. But, as I said before, these people who are in touch with services, who are taking part in research, and this might be why it doesn't completely reflect the results we find when we look at the general population. And within that group, there's a very large range. So some of the people had very low levels of well-being, some had extremely high levels of well-being. And what did we find statistically well-being was associated with? We found many of our outcomes, we found an effect. So people who were more lonely and more socially isolated had lower levels of well-being. People with lower health utility, so lower vision-related quality of life, again had lower well-being. And those who had more limitation of their activities, who found that they were less able to perform tasks, again had lower well-being. And as is well established, people with depression or generalized anxiety disorder also had lower levels of well-being. So that was our univariate analysis. We also did some multivariate statistical techniques where we look at everything together and see what the relative importance of these things are. And what came out very reliably is that the 2 biggest were loneliness and having depression. So loneliness and depression were most strongly associated with well-being, and these are sort of the 2 targets we should really try and target. Importantly, we didn't find an association with any of the demographics or any of the disease factors. So I know this is slightly different to Tina's results this morning, who found well-being as better in people with long duration of disease. We didn't find that effect. And that's really good news, because you can't do much about your age or your ethnic origin or your socioeconomic status, and nor, in many cases, can you do much about the severity of disease people have. So summarising this part of the talk, what affects well-being in people with inherited macular disease? We didn't find disease factors have an effect. We didn't find demographics to have an effect. We did find psychosocial factors like loneliness, health utility, and activity limitation did. And also we found that depression and anxiety had an effect. So what does this mean? This means these things we can intervene with. There are treatments for some of these things are more appropriate. So specifically, I think interventions which help loneliness. These are things like peer support, like the groups we've heard about from Retina UK today, and like social prescribing, which is a technique by which people in GP practices link people into local social groups and local activities, can be a very powerful thing, we think. We haven't tested this in people with vision impairment, but I think this is likely to be very significant. And early, we've heard that already today, early treatment and early identification of depression, of anxiety, early referral to counselling is also very likely to help people's well-being as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Rachel Canavan, who's going to speak about some of the qualitative research and give a little bit more colour to the results. Thanks, Rachel.
Hello, everybody. So as Mike says, I'm going to be talking about the qualitative aspect of our study. So we know that people with vision impairment have reduced well-being relative to those with better vision, but the reasons for this are not fully understood, as we've already heard, and there's a limited evidence base for the effectiveness of emotional support currently offered to this population, and the provision of such support is often inconsistent and disjointed. So the aims of this phase of the study were to explore how the lived experience of people with established vision impairment impacts their well-being, and to explore what strategies support and limit well-being in people with vision impairment. And to do this, I've been looking specifically at lived experience. So, firstly, just to say that some of the participants in the qualitative part of the study also took part in the quantitative part. The inclusion criteria for our participants were that they were adults and that they had a confirmed diagnosis of inherited macular disease of any cause, who met the ICD-11 definition of vision impairment. Participants were excluded if they were non-English speakers or had hearing loss affecting their ability to complete Zoom interviews. We used purposive sampling to identify 11 participants who are all patients at hospital low vision clinics. Now, purposive sampling is a non-probability sampling technique where researchers deliberately select participants based on specific characteristics relevant to the research question. So in this case, vision impairment. Participants' ages range from 20 years old to 77 years old, and we had 5 females and 6 males. Their visual acuity ranged from 0.34 logmar to 2.3 logmar, and participants had to have received their diagnosis at least 5 years before the study. 7 participants were registered as severely sight impaired, 3 were sight impaired, and 1 was not registered. And in terms of ethnicity, 1 was Asian Pakistani, 1 was Asian Bangladeshi, 7 were of white British ethnicity, 1 was white other, and 1 was any other. In terms of socioeconomic status, the participants were from a broad range of socioeconomic groups. And I'd just like to say that I've used pseudonyms here to protect the anonymity of the participants. So to generate the data, we used, I carried out a literature review to see what current scientific evidence there was in the area. And then I devised a semi-structured interview guide, which included open-ended questions. Before I did any interviews with participants, I carried out a test interview with another PhD student. I conducted all the interviews myself, and they all took place online through Zoom, and we recorded them, obviously, with the participants' consent. The recordings were then transcribed verbatim. Now, to analyse the data, I use something called reflexive thematic analysis, and it's a qualitative method which basically identifies, analyses and reports patterns or themes in the data. And it really emphasises the researcher's active role in producing the knowledge through subjective interpretation and reflexivity. There are 6 steps to RTA. The first is familiarisation with the data, which means really immersing yourself in the data and really getting to know what your participants have said. The second part is coding, where you generate succinct labels for key features of the data. You then move on to generating themes, and this is where you group codes into potential larger themes. And then you review themes, and this is where you check themes against the data to make sure that it's all coherent. You then go on to defining your themes, which is where you articulate the essence and the scope of each theme. And finally, you write up your report, where you weave the narrative together into something that everyone can read. So moving on to the results, from the analysis, we developed 2 overarching themes, and these were the impact of vision impairment and support. The impact of vision impairment theme has 4 sub-themes, which are emotional, medical, practical and societal. And the support theme consists of 2 sub-themes, self-support and support from others. And I'm going to go into more detail of these results, but you can see just from this overview how closely our findings link with the results of the Retina UK sight loss survey that we heard about earlier today, and also with the experiences described by the community panel earlier as well. So the emotional sub-theme is constructed from the participants' lived experience of their emotional journey of vision impairment. Many aspects of this emotional journey were negative to the participants' well-being, such as experiences of feeling depressed, angry, frustrated, anxious, embarrassed, and uncertain. And we can see this from something that one of the participants said: very lost, overwhelming, sort of everything. The future was not clear anymore, so that uncertainty was a huge thing. Participants also described feeling inadequate, with another participant saying, I always say to myself, I'm not really fulfilling my potential, perhaps mentally or physically. That really affects me. These emotions manifested in a lack of confidence and low self-esteem, and were often linked to feelings of isolation. One participant said, I felt sad and isolated because of the impact on my activities. This sub-theme has important implications because it highlights ways that participants could be vulnerable to difficulties with social isolation affecting their well-being and mental health. Now moving on to the medical sub-theme. This was constructed from participants' lived experience of their medical journey. Many participants described how shocked they were to receive their diagnosis, with one participant saying, I was shocked, to be honest. I was in shock when I came out because I thought the worst case scenario was I was going to end up with glasses. And they have now come back saying, we're very sorry that there's no glasses that are going to fix what you've got. Also, how they received very little information about their condition and sparse information about available support throughout their medical journey, but especially at the point of diagnosis. One participant said, on diagnosis, when I was told, I got no support whatsoever. The consultant said nothing. He just said, you can become registered maybe, and you get free iPads. That's all I got. Most participants had to research areas of support themselves, and these included things like mobility, financial, practical, and mental health support. The medical journey also included the fear of participants' vision further deteriorating and the anxiety that this caused them, as well as their experience of having a rare disease and how frightening this was. Sadly, participants' medical journey was often accompanied by bad experiences in the hospital, including a lack of understanding and a lack of empathy from clinicians. This sub-theme has important implications as it highlights areas of the participants' medical journey that impacts their well-being and mental health. Next, moving on to the practical sub-theme, this was constructed from the participants' lived experience of the practical consequences of having a vision impairment. Travelling was described as hugely challenging and anxiety-provoking. These challenges included finding their way, having to rely on strangers for help, and feeling unsafe. These experiences limited the participants' ability to travel to meet people or attend social groups, resulting in physical isolation for many participants. This contributed to difficulties in building relationships and a lack of independence in some participants, with one saying, "Suddenly, all that interaction with people was taken away from me. I think I felt lonely at first. I felt lonely because of the restrictions on my activities." Participants also described their anxiety at being reliant on other people for practical assistance and their fear of being a burden. Participants said, "I do feel like sometimes I'm a bit of a nuisance. I feel like I shouldn't have to keep asking them for help. Sometimes I feel like, oh, I'm going to get on their nerves in a minute, and they're just not going to bother." This sub-theme, again, has important implications, particularly in terms of physical isolation, as this has well-researched links to poor well-being. And then we move on to the societal sub-theme. And this was constructed from the participants' lived experience and the impact of societal views, perceptions, and constraints on their vision impairment journey. Participants experienced a lack of understanding and disbelief at their vision impairment from broader society. They also described feeling less than, not feeling like a complete person, and not feeling like a fully functioning member of society due to their vision impairment. I think one participant summed it up very well when they said, "This sense of not feeling whole, I think that's probably different for everybody, but that sense that you're not a reliable, independent, strong adult living being in the world. You're not quite a whole human being because there are things that you can't do that everyone else can." Participants discussed their experience of living with a hidden disability, which impacts their ability to feel part of society and often affects their relationships. They also often wanted to hide their vision impairment, often using maladaptive coping strategies, for example, overuse of alcohol or masking their vision impairment, and additionally by not wanting to be part of the vision impairment community. Participants said, "I had to basically mask a lot, pretty much all the time, and just pretend to somehow make it out as if I could just do the same stuff as everybody else, where clearly I wasn't really able to." The implications of this is that societal views, perceptions, and constraints are a barrier to adults with vision impairment accessing support. Now we move on to the support theme and the sub-theme of self-support. This was constructed from participants' lived experience of how they support their own well-being and mental health. And they did this through a variety of ways, including music, the arts, theatre, creative writing, hobbies such as listening to audiobooks, gaming, sports and exercise. And participants described how these self-support mechanisms were closely linked with their feelings of well-being. One participant saying, "I find exercise is really helpful for me in terms of mental health and well-being." The use of humour was also described as an important self-support mechanism. And participants also spoke about how they have to be resilient and adaptable because of their vision impairment, and how this is a protective factor. A participant said, "You're overcoming adversity every day, then that makes you into a more determined person, and that in turn impacts your mental health because you can push through harder things more." These all have important implications because they help us to better understand the protective factors involved in people with vision impairment supporting their mental well-being. Now we move on to support from others. This was constructed from the lived experience of what external support participants received for their well-being and mental health. Family support was hugely important to participants' well-being. but mainly when offered in a way acceptable to the participant. It could have negative consequences if not carried out in a caring, empathetic manner. And some participants spoke about the negative impact on their well-being if their family were overprotective, with one saying, if you're in a family or an environment where either you're forced to carry on as if nothing's really happened or whatever, then that can be harmful. You get the, oh, you know you can't do this and you can't do that, and cotton wooling, which is also really harmful as well. With regards to support groups, there was a reluctance among participants to join, and this was connected closely to not wanting to be seen as a member of the vision impaired community, and to some not accepting that they have a disability. This is summed up by a participant who said, support groups never really come up as an option, but I haven't wanted them to come up as an option either. I recognise this is deep bias in me about disability, really. I'm shocked to be saying it, but it's true. I have to acknowledge it. I don't want to be in that bracket, in that group. However, all participants reflected on the benefits that support groups could bring, such as the opportunity to connect with other visually impaired people, with one saying, sometimes I felt quite isolated and I felt like nobody understood, and it's kind of nice to see that there's other people out there with what I've got and how they are dealing with it. It makes you feel like you're not the only one. And support groups were also described as helpful as a knowledge exchange network, with another participant saying, support groups are full of other people who are partially sighted. With those, you get lots of tips, advice. You hear about people's experiences, and you can learn lots of new technology. Yes, just getting information and advice about sight loss conditions. Additionally, mental health support, particularly counselling, was important to most participants. And this was often because it assisted them in accepting their vision impairment and beginning to come to terms with it. One said, I was offered access to the hospital's mental health counselling sessions, which were really helpful. Definitely benefited from that. I would absolutely have benefited from that support much earlier on, certainly. Even those who felt that they did not require mental health support still spoke about the benefits they believed it could provide. Other areas of support the participants described as positive were mobility training, charity websites, access to work, iClinic liaison officers, and social services, with one participant saying, a social worker helped me to fill in my disability living allowance application. She was very good. And this subtheme is really important because it helps us to better understand what support is beneficial and how support should best be provided. So, moving on to conclusions. Wellbeing was not significantly lower in our population compared to the general population, but as Michael has already said, it should be noted that our participants are all already receiving support, and results from those not involved with hospital services could be different. Loneliness and depression were associated with well-being, but non-modifiable factors such as demographics and disease factors were not associated with well-being. And well-being is enhanced by self-support, such as sport, social activities, and a sense of humour, and support from others, particularly family and friends. So, we're making some clinical recommendations, and these are especially relevant at the point of diagnosis. We recommend that clinicians' communication skills be enhanced, especially around the subject of giving bad news. We also recommend that clear and understandable disease information should be provided, especially to help alleviate uncertainty. Information about available support and support services should be offered, as should access to counselling, emotional support, and mental health teams. And in terms of future research, we suggest that research is required to investigate interventions which address loneliness, such as social prescribing, as Michael already mentioned, and befriending and peer support schemes. We also suggest that acceptance and commitment therapy be researched more. It's a mindfulness-based therapy that helps people manage difficult thoughts and feelings so they can focus on living meaningfully. And there's, at the moment, only a very small handful of research into ACT for people with vision impairment, but it has shown promise in enhancing well-being in people with vision impairment. And there's a growing body of research showing that ACT is superior to other treatments in improving well-being and mental health to people with other chronic health conditions. So we feel that further research should be carried out to investigate the effectiveness of ACT for people with vision impairment. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening.
We have got time for some questions this time. If Michael and Rachel would like to take any questions in the room.
Hi, so that was focused on mainly individuals with central macular loss. Have you looked at the reverse, so patients with RP and rod cone degeneration?
Not yet. We're very keen to. The main reason for this was the funding was from Macular Society, so why we focused on that. And of course, working in the clinic, you hear very different things, as you'll be aware, from people with different presenting conditions. So I think a lot of the themes would be similar, but it's certainly something we'd like to extend this into people with other forms of inherited eye disease and other forms of vision impairment.
Hi, I have a question for either one of you, really. Some people say that they feel isolation, it's managing their expectations when their eyesight deteriorates. What if they say talking therapies of any sort do not work? How can you gently persuade them that it might be an avenue to opening other, kind of referral pathways?
There is a lot of reluctance, I think. There's still a large stigma around mental health support and receiving counselling and things. I think the best way that we can overcome that is by things like the conference today. We've had the panel sitting here all talking about their experiences. And I think just to normalise it is the best thing we can do. And also to let people become aware of what is actually available, because at the moment there's such a disparity in the information that people get. So a lot of people aren't actually aware that many of the hospitals have counselling services. And I think just putting that information out there, letting them sort of know that it is available if they want it, and also just trying to normalise it and making it acceptable and trying to reduce the stigma. But that's a whole sort of broader society issue as well. So it's quite difficult to overcome. But, yeah.
Thank you both. That was really very interesting. When you were talking about like the link with loneliness and mental well-being, for example, how do we untangle whether the loneliness is causing the mental well-being, or the mental well-being is therefore affecting the loneliness, or is it cyclic and too intertwined to be able to separate?
Right, that's a really interesting question. We are looking, so this is all cross-sectional so far, we are looking longitudinally at people with newly developed macular disease and trying to work out that direction of association. There's also some work, Zhang in the USA has looked at this, and they do seem to think it's activity limitation, loneliness, and then reduced well-being. So I think it's that direction. But it's really difficult to model because it's so complex. Then the other answer is, does it matter? If we target one, we'll probably help the other. So it doesn't almost matter which is chicken, which is egg. If we try and reduce loneliness, that is likely to have an impact on well-being, regardless of mechanism, probably.
Thank you. This is for both of you. I've experienced with the work that I've done that some people find that they turn from the hospital when their well-being deteriorates, and they turn to the GPs. And in some scenarios, some medications that are offered in relation to improving depression and loneliness can actually impact visual acuity of the people consuming them. Is there any interest in your team into looking into more information for GPs who potentially offer those medications without the knowledge that the impact to the visual acuity is there? Just obviously, I know that it's an interesting point, because obviously there are benefits to taking them, but with diseases that might not have clear medical instruction on how to be treated, those kind of it feels as though those people who are feeling lonely and also down in the dumps kind of left with limited access to help.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting point. The clinical psychologist we work with, Mark Tibber, has done lots of work on the interaction of physical and mental health and getting support in the right services. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I think informing people in primary care as well about this is really, really important. So no, it's an extremely important point. Thank you.
Right, thank you both. Sorry, that's all the questions we have time for now, because it's time to break for lunch.